Afghan civilians take flight as the Taliban advances and U.S. forces make their exit. As the militants advance on key cities, the first of tens of thousands of Afghans who aided coalition forces tried to flee the country. Is the U.S. withdrawal worsening the refugee crisis? And does Washington bear responsibility? I'm Andrea Sanke, and today's newsmaker is Afghans fleeing the Taliban. Afghan civilians are being urged to evacuate the besieged capital of Helmand Province ahead of a planned army offensive against the Taliban there. At least 40 civilians have been killed in the past 24 hours as the Taliban continues its ground assault against the government forces in the southern city of Lashkar Gah. The Taliban has been making huge advances toward Afghan cities in recent weeks, taking their fight from rural to urban areas in what some consider a turning point in the conflict. More and more Afghans are fleeing their homes as the Taliban takes control of more territory amid the U.S. troop withdrawal. Now, a small number of Afghans who assisted the U.S. mission have been taken to the United States. President Joe Biden is calling the relocation of 221 former contractors an important milestone. They arrived just hours after Congress approved more than $1 billion in extra funding for the Afghan Special Immigrant Visa Program. That money will help transport and resettle an additional 8,000 refugees. But it's unlikely the Biden administration will be able to evacuate all 20,000 Afghans who've applied for those special visas before U.S. troops completely withdraw at the end of the month. Now, the evacuation effort, dubbed Operation Allies Refuge, could eventually include as many as 50,000 interpreters and others at risk for assisting the U.S. during the 20-year conflict. But they're just a fraction of the wave of people trying to flee the country. Others are attempting to use smuggling networks to get across the border into Iran and then on to Turkey. The Pentagon says half of all district centers in Afghanistan are now under Taliban control, and less than a quarter of the $1.3 billion in international aid has been delivered. That, combined with severe drought, is creating one of the region's worst refugee crises. Afghan President Ashraf Ghani has blamed the country's deteriorating security situation on what he portrayed as Washington's sudden decision to withdraw its troops.
The reason for our current situation is that the decision to withdraw was taken abruptly. I once told the President of the United States that I respected his decision, but I knew that it would have some consequences and that the responsibility for the risk management would fall on Afghan people. Managing the risks posed by the withdrawal of international forces is our responsibility.
Well, Ghani also said Afghan authorities had worked out a 6-month plan to thwart the Taliban, but he acknowledged the militants were no longer a scattered and inexperienced movement. Let's look at the Taliban's transformation over the past 3 decades.
In February 1989, Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan. Over the next few years, the country was embroiled in civil war as tribal leaders battled for power. And in September 1994, the Taliban was formed. Within months, the militant group had seized control of Kandahar, one of Afghanistan's most significant cities. By September 1996, they'd taken the capital, Kabul, and formed one of the world's most repressive regimes. For the next 5 years, they made steady gains, eventually seizing control of most of the country. Then a month after September 11th, 2001, US-led forces invaded Afghanistan to stop the Taliban from providing shelter to Al-Qaeda. By the end of the year, the Taliban regime had collapsed, forcing their leader Mullah Muhammad Omar to flee. But it wasn't the end of the Taliban. Many retreated to the south and areas bordering Pakistan, and over the course of 2 decades, they carried out a violent insurgency. By 2018, the Taliban had made massive gains and reportedly held almost 40% of the country, forcing the Afghan government to invite them to peace talks as a legitimate political force. Then in July 2021, US forces withdrew from Bagram Air Base, the center of the American military operation. Now the Taliban claims to have taken control of more than half of Afghanistan.
Well, let's unpack the current situation now. And from Geneva, I'm joined by Torek Farhadi. He is an advisor, was an advisor to the Afghan government under former President Hamid Karzai. Michael Kugelman is in Washington. He is the deputy director for the Asia program at the Wilson Center. And Ashraf Haidari is Afghanistan's ambassador to Sri Lanka, and he joins us from Colombo. Thanks all so much for being with us. First, to the best of your ability, let's talk about what's happening on the ground in Afghanistan and how much of the country really is under Taliban control. Vacant land is one thing, population is another. So far, it seems they haven't taken any major urban centers, though we're hearing they're getting close. Michael Kugelman, will they take those urban centers?
Well, certainly the Taliban is threatening to take urban centers, and we've had a battlefield stalemate that's prevailed for much of the last 20 years, where the Taliban has been able to hold sway and control a fair amount of territory in rural areas, but the Afghan state, the Afghan government, has been able to maintain control of cities. But indeed, in recent days, we've seen the Taliban engage in offensives in multiple provincial capitals. And I think that the fact that U.S. air power will soon be removed from the battlefield equation, that will be a major advantage to the Taliban, just because for so many years, Afghan ground forces have been able to depend on the support of NATO air power to push out the Taliban when it's tried to get into cities. So I do fear that there is a strong possibility that one or more provincial capitals could fall in the weeks and months ahead. But at this point, it's too preliminary to be making any clear judgments.
Okay. Torek Farhadi, are you worried particularly about what's happening right now in Lashkar Gah?
Well, I'm worried for the civilians, yes, because intense fighting is going on. We have seen families being displaced from their homes, and in the middle of the night, the UN just issued a communique a few minutes ago, talking to Taliban and both the government, because in this situation of indiscriminate fighting, although the Taliban are the originators of the attack, but now the general in charge of the security of Lashkar Gah, whose authority from a geographic standpoint is shrinking, the Taliban have taken most of Lashkar Gah except a few government buildings, has asked the people to clear their homes because he wants to attack and clear the city. That means that in this fighting, some homes will be destroyed and more IDPs, as you can see on the screen, will be produced, and the international community will have to pick up the tab to take care of them. This is not a good solution. I think peace is a better solution, and I am a proponent of localized peace programs, where if the government cannot make peace in general with Taliban, in some areas where the humanitarian crisis is acute, the international community should encourage some type of local peace and ceasefire to hold.
Okay, I mean, that seems complicated, though. If there are so many areas where these individual agreements would have to be agreed to, how could that work?
It has worked in Kandahar for a few days during the Eid, and it has worked in Badghis in northwestern Afghanistan. It's not a perfect solution because anything is dependent on the center in Afghanistan. But to tell you the truth, overall peace in Afghanistan is not imaginable in the next few years. So at the end of the day, we will end up with pockets where the population will be under the Taliban. They will have to live under their harsh rule, but they will accept it. And in the big cities, the government would remain in charge and trying to defend the borders of the city. But each city in Afghanistan has its own vulnerabilities. In Herat, where the government and Ismail Khan are fighting the Taliban, there are also elements in the city who are sort of opening the doors for the Taliban to enter. Otherwise, the Taliban will not survive, really, the situation. And other cities are vulnerable to this situation as well.
Right. Ashraf Haidari, it's chilling to hear that Torek Farhadi says overall peace is not actually foreseeable in Afghanistan in the coming years. I mean, what does that amount to you? Are you on the same page there, first of all, or more optimistic? If not, then do you see Afghanistan potentially devolving into civil war?
I think, given the complexity of the situation in Afghanistan involving multiple regional and extra-regional stakeholders, the issue of security, on the one hand, one can be optimistic, provided that the principal stakeholders, particularly the United States, actually acts in ways that should jumpstart the peace process in Afghanistan, and to immediately get the countries, in this case, especially Pakistan, to bring to bear the kind of pressure that Pakistan has over the Taliban to return to the negotiation table, on the one hand, to at the same time to declare a ceasefire, starting with, of course, a significant reduction in the violence that we have seen, which my colleague just pointed out, has driven out 360,000 innocent civilians from across Afghanistan, especially these days from Lashkar Gah areas around Herat, and as well as Kandahar. And for the United Nations to really, act on the provisions of the international humanitarian law and human rights law concerning the Taliban's complete disregard for human dignity, and really documenting, and it's already being documented as we speak, and investigating and prosecuting the Taliban and those outside Afghanistan that derive this imposed terror campaign in Afghanistan for war crimes. Just in Kandahar, in Spin Poldak, the Taliban have summarily executed 300 innocent civilians that either somehow work with the government or at some relatives that work with the Afghan government, and so forth. And they have done the same thing across Afghanistan in areas where they have temporary, run over.
Right.
And I should also highlight here, which my colleague didn't, both of them, that the Taliban are not alone. Just over the past couple of months since the announcement by the United States of withdrawal of their forces, 10,000 militants from Pakistan, with, of course, members of the Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, Ansarullah, Jundullah, the TTP, that's the Tariq-e-Taliban of Pakistan, ETIM, and as well as IMU of Uzbekistan and Al-Qaeda, have joined the Taliban, and these offenses that have captured some of the areas which we've been now recapturing, clearing, some areas, as we have been doing in the north. And also, I disagree with my colleague in the fact that the Taliban have taken, all of Lashkar Gah. I completely disagree. There are lots of areas within Lashkar Gah. It's a very large city that, are firmly under our control, and our very brave and courageous and general has made it clear that as we, of course, empty some of those neighborhoods where the Taliban are using human shields. The human shield, that's another far cry. Then we can, of course, push them back and defend the city more forcefully, of course, with the continued airstrikes that we have had US and our own forces.
It's interesting. I did hear a representative of the Afghan Special Forces say that part of the problem is the Taliban don't hesitate to kill innocent civilians when they make their advances. The problem is the Afghan security forces don't want to kill their own, and that puts them at a disadvantage because the Taliban will use unlimited violence. But let me ask you this, Michael Kugelman, because you had brought up the airstrikes and that it is rather unfortunate that those will cease because they are of so much help to Afghan security forces. Is there any way that at the very least, could be reversed, especially when we hear about the other elements coming into Afghanistan that, as he said, the Taliban are not alone. There are a number of militant elements coming in, and they will be able to build their forces greater if they are given free range under Taliban control. Do you think the U.S. should actually, in order especially to prevent a massive refugee crisis from developing, should reconsider its air support in Afghanistan?
Well, I mean, there are risks to the use of U.S. air power, I should say. I mean, the more you use air power, the more risk there is to civilians. And we have seen, unfortunately, on a number of occasions in recent years that airstrikes have killed civilians in cities and beyond in Afghanistan. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, particularly because we do have a focus on civilians in this discussion. But look, the Biden administration was very clear in stating that it's leaving Afghanistan not because of the insurgency and the increasing violence of the insurgency, but it's leaving because it has concluded that the threat of terrorism to U.S. interests and personnel beyond Afghanistan is not sufficiently strong to warrant U.S. troops staying. So, this is why the optics are really terrible and heartbreaking. The U.S. has been accelerating this withdrawal at the moment when the Taliban is waging what appear to be unprecedented offensives. So, yes, to answer your question, I do think that there certainly would be value, tactical value, in maintaining some degree of U.S. airstrike capacity to be deployed against the Taliban for the foreseeable future. The problem with that is that if the U.S. were to do that, the Taliban would view that as a clear violation of the agreement that the U.S. signed with the Taliban last year without the involvement of the Afghan government, which is very significant and one reason why that agreement is so controversial and flawed. But the Taliban would view any U.S. Military activities against the Taliban beyond the withdrawal as something that's not allowed, and that would essentially compel the Taliban to redeclare its war on U.S. forces, which would make it even more difficult for U.S. forces to try to help Afghan forces in pushing back against the Taliban. So it's a very complicated state of affairs.
Okay.
I do think, sorry.
No, I can see Ashraf Haidari shaking his head very quickly. Why do you disagree with Michael?
Well, I disagree simply because it's the Taliban which has violated and reneged on their own commitments under the Doha Agreement with the United States. The United States and the Afghan government actually have delivered. We remember released over 5,000 prisoners of the Taliban, including drug traffickers and others with war crimes. The United States, of course, and NATO declared, and then now they're withdrawing completely from Afghanistan. And now, of course, that leaves the Taliban and the regional, state sponsor with no excuse, and as well as, of course, SCO members. I'm in China and Russia, some of the countries that I used to engage with quite often in my last job, that they have no reason whatsoever not to support the Afghan peace process. Especially based on that unprecedented concessions that we made. Remember, the Taliban committed to reducing violence and then to, commit to a ceasefire and then engage in a results-driven peace talks towards a sustainable political, settlement. None of which they have delivered on. They have actually used the Doha office as another, combat outpost, exploiting it to gain further legitimacy and to support their, terrorist campaign in Afghanistan. And so that's why I think if the United States now is supporting us and this, air support continues, and of course that would happen as long as the Taliban and their state sponsor continues this onslaught across our cities. Of course, victimizing foremost the civilians. It's not so much, of course, our military forces that they're killing civilians, they're wounding civilians as we speak now.
We're down to our last few minutes. Torek Farhadi, I want to get you back into the conversation. If you can give us a better idea, actually, of how Afghan civilians really do feel. I mean, the images we are seeing are deeply disturbing. People are scared. And it's interesting because we've heard so many times that the Taliban in negotiations, because they are Afghan brothers of sorts, they have to be engaged with. Peace has to be found with them. But if they are, why are people running scared? So can you tell us, is there any level of sympathy for the Taliban among a majority of Afghan civilians that may have to succumb to Taliban rule now?
I would say that there's no sympathy for the Taliban because the people of Afghanistan have experimented the Taliban from 1996 to 2001. And in that time, the Taliban forced the women to stay at home. And when I returned to work in Afghanistan in 2002, I saw a generation of bright women in Afghanistan who had missed on 5 years of education. So if this is what the Taliban promise the Afghan people, and also the anecdotes of harshness with the population and sort of summary justice that they deliver. They had hanged a couple of people in Helmand a couple of days ago because those people had kidnapped a child. So on both sides, on social media, you see justification for what one does or doesn't, but it is clear that their rule is a harsh rule and unacceptable to most of us.
And it's amazing because I've never heard a single Afghan say that anyone really does trust the Taliban. They have a vision for Afghanistan that will really throw the country back to the Middle Ages. And they, even though they've said in negotiations they want peace, they want to see their women in school, you hear others say that no, it is their duty to God that they are willing to die for to reclaim the caliphate that they have always wanted. You have to wonder what is being negotiated with. I'm so unfortunately going to have to leave it there because we're completely out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. And I'm sure we'll be speaking plenty about this going forward. So what kind of a global threat could a resurgent Taliban pose? Well, to help answer that, I'm joined now from Melbourne, Australia, by Greg Barton. He's a professor of global Islamic politics at Deakin University. Thanks so much for being with us. You've said, I'm going to quote you back to you, that the so-called U.S. peace process with the Taliban has been irresponsible and incompetent, that there are virtually no checks and balances in place to hold the Taliban to account. That leaves Afghans in a horrible situation. But what threat does it really pose to the rest of the world?
Well, it's a tragic situation for 38 million people in Afghanistan, particularly for women and children, of course. But it's a global threat. Al-Qaeda, as we know it, in Southeast Asia, Jamaat Islamiyah, these terror networks began in Afghanistan back during the Soviet occupation in the late 80s and early 90s. Most of the problems we've faced over these last 3 decades have come out of Afghanistan. It's not clear that the Taliban will take control of the country, but even now they're providing a safe haven for Al-Qaeda, and along the sides, Islamic State with splinter groups has also found a safe haven, and there are reports of thousands of foreign fighters coming into Afghanistan. So none of it's clear, but it's all very worrying.
Right. And if the situation does destabilize further and the Taliban does take control, how difficult would it be for the United States and coalition forces to try to get back in, to eliminate threats that might be there?
Look, I think the last 20 years have shown us that you can't eliminate threats. It's a question of controlling them. I think closing Bagram Air Base and pulling out 95% of their presence at this point already shows how dangerous the situation is. There is some chance of turning things around. The Taliban haven't taken the district capitals or provincial capitals and major cities like Kabul. But they are counting on a collapse of morale. They are counting on the Afghan military and government just giving up hope and melting away. And key to this is the question of air support. Pulling out the American forces also pulled out 18,000 contractors to keep the Afghan Air Force aircraft, the helicopters, the transport aircraft flying. And that's really critical in this mountainous country. The Taliban control the national ring road. You can't get between the major cities except by flying. Right. And if the Afghan Air Force can't do that, then everyone's in trouble.
You know, it's interesting because the U.S. justified this pullout in part saying, you know, it's an unwinnable war, it's a never-ending war. But was it ever really about winning or just trying to minimize even more dangerous consequences? So as bad as it's been, it could get significantly worse for all players involved.
Look, that's a really good question. I think the problem was framing this in unclear terms. The idea at the very beginning was to go after the Al-Qaeda leadership and deny them using Afghanistan as a safe haven. and it looks like 20 years on, those aims are failing completely. It is possible. I mean, there's been great progress in Afghanistan in 20 years, particularly when it comes to education of women and children, transformation in cities like Kabul. It's possible to hang on to that and defend it, even though the Taliban will remain a presence in the rural areas. But at the moment, all of that is at risk, and that will give a safe haven to Al-Qaeda and to other terrorist groups. It was wrong to frame this as a binary choice between staying or going. The major international presence was taken out in 2014. The US presence in recent years has just been a few thousand. That was enough to be maintained indefinitely to provide access to civilian contractors to keep aircraft flying and to give the Afghan military a chance. I think it was wrong to frame it as something that couldn't be sustained.
Right. And now, as a result, do you think we might see, if it doesn't descend into civil war, simply an Afghanistan that's kind of broken into pieces, into areas that are controlled by the Taliban, who won't compromise? They're not really interested in any other sort of vision other than what they held on to from decades past, versus the urban areas that might be controlled by Afghan forces, where women will still continue to be educated and there will be some semblance of democracy.
Yeah, sad to say, that's actually the best case scenario. The civil war never really ceased. It's been pretty much 40 years of civil war, but it's flared up, it's arced up in recent years, particularly this year. So if the Afghan government can hang on to the cities, and if those advances, particularly for women, can be maintained in the cities, that's at this point a good outcome, but it would still leave a country divided and still racked by civil conflict. The worst case scenario, of course, is a total Taliban takeover. Right. And even if they don't achieve that, just open war between competing factions would also be awful. Okay, Greg Barton, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being with us on this edition of The Newsmakers. We really appreciate it. And that is all for this edition. Remember, you can always follow us on Twitter at @the_newsmakers. I'll be back tomorrow with another edition. Do stay with us on TRT World.